It's here.
You'll be presenting?
Yes.
Okay, this presentation.
Just that one. Okay. And then I see, yeah, okay.
Can
Yeah.
you
Okay.
put the computer down and I will bring it up? Otherwise, I think people won't see me behind the screen.
We'll have, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Just to give it
I think we start, Mike? Yeah. Good morning. Good morning. Bienvenue à tous. Ladies and gentlemen, do sit down. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. Moi, je m'appelle John McNee, je suis le secrétaire général du Centre mondial de pluralisme. Notre centre a été établi, fondé par Son Altesse l'Arakan, en partenariat avec le gouvernement du Canada. The center is an independent research and education organization dedicated to advancing respect for diversity and the benefits of inclusion around the world. The vision of the Aga Khan is that the center should be a destination for thought leaders from around the world. This morning, we are delighted to partner with the Pathfinders Initiative and the International Development Research Centre to host the Canadian launch of the Taskforce on Justice report, Justice for All. At the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals is the vision of a just, inclusive, equitable, and peaceful world in which there is progress not just for some, but for all. Addressing structural inequalities and exclusions is key to achieving the SDGs. And the Justice for All report makes an important contribution on this issue. Pluralism is about recognition and belonging. And one of the most startling findings relates to the issue of legal recognition. The report shows that over 1 billion people lack legal identity, preventing them from claiming their rights, accessing basic protections of the law, or even simply living in full and equal members of their societies. Recognition is not only a legal issue, but a moral one. It determines who belongs and who doesn't. Without recognition, the goal of just and inclusive societies for all will remain unrealized. Today, we are extraordinarily fortunate to hear from members of the task force who helped prepare the report, as well as a very distinguished panel of experts. In a couple of minutes, we'll hear from Nathalie Drouin, Canada's Deputy Minister of Justice and Deputy Attorney General, and Ambassador Curia of Argentina, who will introduce a brief video message from the Argentine Minister of Justice and Human Rights. Following this, and just as soon as her taxi arrives, Alison Maynard Gibson, the former Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Bahamas and member of the task force, will present the findings of the report. And finally, we will have the great pleasure of hearing from Mary Robinson, who really needs no introduction. We all know her tremendous work in Ireland, at the UN, now as chair of the elders. It was my great privilege to work with her at the United Nations. And I have a long speech about Mary here, but I just say that she has fought and fought so successfully for all of the great causes. So it's a particular honor to have Mary with us at the Global Center for Pluralism. So following those presentations, there'll be a panel discussion and questions and answers. So before moving on to the presentations, I'd like to invite Dominique Charron, who is Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at IDRC, to say a few words. Dominique, welcome.
Thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. I won't take up a lot of time. I just really am delighted to provide a few words of welcome on behalf of Canada's International Development Research Centre. Thanks to the Global Centre and John in particular for hosting us today. And a welcome to the panelists. I'm sure this is going to be a really stimulating conversation this morning. Quite an impressive panel of women, I might add. So delighted to be here. Pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas, le Centre de recherche pour le développement international est un organisme du gouvernement fédéral qui a pour but d'appuyer des recherches par les chercheurs du Sud pour répondre aux questions de développement dans les pays du Sud. As part of Canada's International Assistance Family or portfolio, the International Development Research Centre supports research to help propulse change, positive change in the Global South, and really supports the development of strengths and organizations in the South to do that research. And so as part of that effort, we have been very honored to be a knowledge partner and a key partner in the development of this work. Some of the work echoes some of the work that IDRC has done in the area of access to justice for women and for people living either in poverty or otherwise at the margins is echoed in the findings of the report. And we have seen that the evidence-based and community-driven solutions that are necessary to tackle the big justice challenges in the countries where we work. And I'll just give two quick examples, one of which you'll be hearing a bit more about later. In Nairobi, Kenya, for example, IDRC supported the development of well-timed evidence combined with some specifically targeted legal strategies to help set in motion the major transformation and upgrading process in the Mukuru slums, and this is one of the biggest kind of slum upgrades of its kind, and this was based on efforts to improve recognition and of the rights of the people in that slum. In another example, in 5 sub-Saharan countries, including Sierra Leone, Kenya, Cameroon, Mali, Senegal, and Nigeria, different legal empowerment models have been tested in an effort to not only strengthen, but also scale up access to and respect for the land rights of women and other vulnerable groups. And Eleanor Thompson will speak to some of this work in a little bit. So finally, the task force, in our view, the task force presents a really important set of global work on the justice gap. It charts a path for all of us in the international community to make justice for all a reality. The report's findings and the recommendations, not only are they timely, but they're really pointing to how we need to accelerate to meet the not only SDG 16, but the intersection of access to justice with the entire Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030. We have a little bit more than a decade to go and an awful lot of work to do. Le CRDI est fier d'être inclus comme un des partenaires de justice pour le rapport Justice pour tous et aussi de pouvoir vous accueillir aujourd'hui avec nos partenaires pour le lancement canadien du rapport et le lancement de sa version française. Thanks very much for the opportunity to say a few words, and I look forward to the conversation.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci pour votre accueil chaleureux. Merci au CRDI, merci Madame Charon pour votre partenariat. Merci John, and thank you in particular for allowing us to enjoy this beautiful space this morning. I too would like to acknowledge that we are gathering this morning in the traditional territory of the Algonquin. It is appropriate, I think, that we have that meeting this morning at the Center for Global Pluralism. As John said, the vision of this organization is for a world where human differences are valued and diverse societies thrive. The timing of our gathering is also important on the margin of the Open Government Partnership Summit. And we know that open government is an important component of access to justice. Et tout comme Madame Charon, je suis particulièrement heureuse de partager le fruit du groupe de travail et le lancement aujourd'hui de la version française du rapport. So I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak with this distinguished group today, in particular, Mary Robinson and member Alison Menard-Gibson. The task force works led by the Pathfinder for Peace really aims to mobilize the international communities, and we were really successful to create that momentum, that energy, and that synergy, in particular in line with the Sustained Development Goals, all the 17, because justice is really across the 17 goals, but Sustained Development Goal 16 in particular. So I would like to recognize really the leadership of the co-chairs of the task force, Netherlands for sure, Sierra Leone, Argentina, and of course the elders represented today, as I said, by Mary Robinson. Together, you have succeeded to galvanize so many from around the world to move forward in really an unprecedented movement and manner to bring the attention of the global community to the case of investing in justice. And personally, as a member of the high-level group of Justice for Women, which was one of the task force work stream, I'm really honored to have played a supporting role in the efforts to advance opportunity to increase access to justice for women in particular. Women is another great area and great area of importance for Government of Canada. So gender equality is part of Government of Canada agenda. So the Canada's feminist approach begin with gender equality. To empowered women and girls, it's really the primary means to challenge poverty and to put an end to poverty and inequality. So during the 2018 G7 presidency, Canada made history by focusing on advancing gender equality and women's empowerment and integrating these issues into all G7 teams' commitment and initiatives. Building on Canada's commitment at the G7, Canada will host the Women Deliver 2019 next week in Vancouver from June 3rd to June 6th. So the Women Deliver Conference is the world's largest gathering of the world leaders, advocates, academics, and also activists on the health, rights, and well-being of women and girls. And this year's the conference will focus on power and how it can drive and how it can end poverty and inequality and how we can make progress and how we can build changes. Unfortunately, disparity in access to justice experienced by women and girls still remain a significant issue and can limit the progress and change both here and abroad. Without justice, the world will not be able, as I said, to end poverty, reduce inequality, or create conditions for shared and sustainable prosperity or promote peace and inclusion. More need to be done. To address this, Canada will continue first to address sexual and gender-based violence, support women's rights organizations and movement, improve public sector institutional capacity to build gender equality, and contribute to a strong evidence base for gender equality actions. In regions of the world where the poorest and most vulnerable have limited or no essential services, and where they are also face devastating effects of conflict and natural disasters, Canada will help ensure that they have access to quality healthcare and nutrition, education, and timely human assistance. Canada's new Feminist International Assistance Policy will help protect and preserve human dignity. And this goes hand in glove with efforts to improve access to justice. With this alignment of Canada's priorities for advancing women's empowerment and the work of high-level groups of justice for women, I think it was natural to have a representative as this committee, and I was delighted and also really privileged to be a member of the high-level committee. So I would like to take just a couple of moments to highlight the major points of our work. The high-level group looked at all of the challenges and the needs that women are facing accessing justice. The needs are so important for the women who live in poverty and are facing very difficult challenges. And this diversity of experience must be taken into account. There is also strength in the case of, as I said before, investing in women access to justice, which has been shown and which has been proved to produce very high results in terms of development, national income, and economic growth. The Justice for All report indicate a growing body of evidence demonstrate that spending in justice, spending in people-centered justice can deliver a high return on investment. Increased justice reduces the risk of conflict and also instability. Every dollar we invest in justice is likely to return at least $16 in benefits and reduce of conflict. So tackling everyday justice problems also deliver benefits. Like, for example, specialized courts such like drug treatment courts have demonstrated to reduce reoffending, saving the criminal justice system thousands of dollars and also making sure that we bring victims and offenders in the system. Restorative justice approaches are highly cost-effective and result in higher satisfaction, again, for victims and also offender. In Canada, restorative justice is being pursued with greater results. Last fall, all the Canadian justice ministers, public safety ministers were successful to build a consensus on increasing more in restorative justice in each the federal and all the provinces and the territories. So I do believe that citizen-focused justice allows us to see the individual who serves, we are serving, more than only seeing the institution. And when we do that, the argument on investing in justice comes a little bit clearer. Justice surveys are necessary to understand the gaps in services and to understand the needs we have to fulfill. So the justice system has to be seen now as an integrated part of other sectors like education and like health. We need to see justice, as I said, as an essential partner, and Justice for All reports really expose that important to see the justice as part of the other sector and not as a silo. The report of the Taskforce on Justice includes call to action, and I do believe that the call to action is really powerful. It puts people at the heart, at the center of the effort we have to put in place. I am really hopeful that collectively we'll be able to make a difference. Along with the sustained development goals, we have witnessed around the world that open government is tied to the concept of access to justice. So as I said yesterday at the department, it's only really recently that we see the connection and the link between open government and access to justice. And I'm really pleased that now we are seeing that. And I'm also pleased that this afternoon, today, we'll have discussion about open government and access to justice. So the task force, and we'll hear about that later this morning, really urge us to put in place the necessary mechanism to improve accountability and to make sure that we are able to identify the key measurements to make sure that we are continuing making progress. So again, congratulations for this great event. I'm really proud to have a Canada launch of the task force report. And as I said, especially proud to have un rapport en français. Merci beaucoup. Bonne continuité. Bon sommet.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Minister. I do apologize, there wasn't a proper introduction. As in all partnerships, communication is key. And the one little detail we failed to communicate about was who would introduce the speaker. But my name is Maaike de Lange. I work with the Pathfinders, and we are very grateful for the partnership we've had with IDRC and the Global Center on Pluralism for this launch. So my role now will just be to introduce the next speaker. But let me thank you, Madam Deputy Minister, for your words, for Canada's support to the work of the task force, for being here, but also by hosting the innovation group meeting and your membership and commitment to the high-level group on justice for women. So we really appreciate your support. The next speaker will be a video message from Minister Garavano, introduced by the ambassador of Argentina to Canada. As has been said, Argentina, the Netherlands, and Sierra Leone are co-chairs of the task force, and they've shown tremendous leadership. So please, Ambassador Curia.
Bonjour, mesdames, messieurs. It's very nice to be here in the Pluralism Center, and it reminds me that finally in one report, the divisions between common law and civil law has been overcome with some other, like in some other forums, and finally we are in a good pluralism system. I have the pleasure to to represent Minister Garavano, but I have to explain you that it's not only because I am the ambassador here, but before coming here, I worked 2 years with Minister Garavano as his head of international affairs, let's say. I know him for ages, and Garavano is a guy committed with the access to justice, open justice, and transitional justice. So everything that will be possible to be pushed forward in order to improve life of the people will be very dear to his heart. Mais en même temps, Garavano a eu des forces derrière lui, deux femmes. Madame Rodriguez, qui maintenant elle est devenue vice-ministre de la Justice, et Sandra Elena, qui est notre spécialiste, la chef du département de la Open Justice. Garavano has had the possibility to record a message for all of us, so I would prefer for him to say the words, and then I will make a couple of comments, so we can go ahead if technology permits.
Good morning, my name is Germán Garavano. I'm the Minister of Justice and Human Rights of Argentina. I could not attend the summit this time, but I did not want to miss the opportunity to send this message. Argentina is committed to keep pushing forward reforms to achieve greater access to justice and more transparent and effective justice. We also want to keep cooperation with other countries that way to walk this way. We have worked for 2 years in the Justice Taskforce to narrow the justice gap. 1.5 billion people who need access to justice and cannot get it. With more than 30 countries, we signed the Declaration of The Hague and Buenos Aires in order to work together so that more and more people can access an inclusive, efficient, and transparent justice. Today, we will present here the final report of the task force that was approved during the meeting that I had pleasure to chair this month in Buenos Aires. This report explains the current barriers to access to justice and suggests innovative solutions to bring them down. I believe that the Open Government Project provides an excellent framework for those governments that have the political will to carry out reforms in a collaborative way with the civil society and based on the transformative vision of open government. From the particular perspective of justice, the OGP has become a very powerful tool to carry out the reforms that help us create justice for all, focus on the people, their needs, and their expectations. For this reason, I believe that today, more than ever, it is necessary to keep advancing in the strengthening of the coalition for open justice. This coalition should be a space for cooperation, exchange, and international debate focused on closing the justice gap. We started building it at the last OGP summit in Georgia, and we must keep working to consolidate it. That is why I welcome to celebrate in this summit, an opportunity to keep joining forces for, as proposed by the United Nations 2030 Agenda, achieving more peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. It will be an honor for Argentina to co-chair the OGP by end of this year, and for us to lead on justice issues from that position and help achieve justice for all. This is our target. We work together to get it. Thank you very much, and good morning.
So with these simple words from Garavano encompassing the ideas, I would like to stress or to highlight a couple of ideas. First, from the organizational and procedural way, the idea of pushing forward to get a coalition on justice is something that has to be established, or to get a concrete issue on that. Si on lit les journaux, les rapports accablants, disons, il y a une demande de justice à travers le monde, que ça veut dire que les défis sont éternels presque. Et comme a dit le vice-ministre du Canada, on prend l'éducation, la santé et la justice comme des éléments du noyau du gouvernement ouvert. So from that point of view, we are, Garabano is committed to push on the idea of the Coalition for Justice and also to have, between inverted commas, more justice within the OGP scheme. So that's our compromise and our idea to go once Argentina will be the co-leader or co-chair of the OGP starting in September, October. But then to finish my presentation, I would like to, between inverted commas, sell our last national production, which is Open Justice, an innovation-driven agenda for inclusive societies. Sandra Elena is the force behind this great publication, which has data from the most strange sectors, and on top of that, from Mexico, Costa Rica, and some other countries. So the good news is that you don't have to carry this because it's online, or she will explain you later how to get it on it. So this is another contribution of Argentina to the big debate and to the big, let's say, needs to get concrete information on access to justice and on open justice. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a pleasure to address you. Thank you very much. And je suis très content qu'il y aura un rapport en français. Peut-être que je pourrais piquer un. Ça dépendra. Et good morning and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Minister Garabano, and thank you, Argentina, for the leadership in this area. There's not only a report in French, but also in Spanish, as I think you may be aware. We are trying to translate it into other languages, and all those materials are available on the website. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Alison Gibson, Maynard Gibson, former Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Bahamas. She was supposed to arrive here last night, flying in from Boston, but her flight was canceled because of the weather in the northeast of the United States. And so she's been traveling all night to be here with us. We're very grateful for that. She has been a member of the Taskforce on Justice, and she came all the way here to present you with the contents of the report. So please, I invite you to the podium.
Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here and on such an exciting occasion. So I'd like to thank, I missed the minister's remarks, and I'd like to thank her for them and thank the Center for so kindly hosting us. Let's see. Okay. You know that the task force was chaired by the ministers from Argentina, whom you heard, the Netherlands, Sierra Leone, and the elders. We have one of them with us this morning. And you know that it is an initiative of the Pathfinders for Peaceful and Just Societies. I'll show you very briefly the members of the task force and their Sherpas, the co-chairs and their Sherpas. These are the members of the task force. I think we can put this PowerPoint up online too if you would like to see it. And I'll go straight into the substance of the report. Is this working? Is it me? Okay. So what we discovered, and we're really concerned about and bring to your attention, is that we live in a world where 5.1 billion people, yes, billion people, that's 2/3 of the world's population, do not have meaningful access to justice. We show here some of the problems. 4.5 billion are excluded from the social, economic, and political opportunities that the law provides, such as land, tenure, and housing. They're employed in the informal economy, or they can't get their legal identity sorted out. 1.5 billion have justice problems that they can't solve. And some of you may have been through a legal maze yourself, as we present here. The justice system can present those kinds of problems. People don't know where to go to seek help. They feel that the processes are too expensive or too slow or they're unfair. They have problems with the criminal and the civil side of the justice system. And 253 million live in extreme conditions of injustice without any meaningful legal protections, such as they are in conflict arenas, they are exposed to modern day slavery, or they're exposed to statelessness. Injustice is costly. Without justice, just without good health care, people in societies fail to reach their full potential. We've discovered that people with justice problems lose an average of a month's wages. Imagine that impact on the economy. And that everyday justice problems, every day, cost countries 0.5 to 3% of their GDP. No small number. So what would it cost to provide justice for all? In low-income countries, $20 a day. Middle-income countries, a year, $64. And in high-income countries, $190. Let me repeat that. $20 per person per year in low-income countries. In middle-income countries, $64 per person per year. And in high-income countries, $190 per person per year. Small sums. For some people, the cost of going out to dinner. So we are urging that people should be put first or put at the center of justice systems. In the past, justice reforms have focused on institutions that can be distant from people. And for those of us who are prominent or who practice in the legal arena, we know that we focus on the system and sometimes forget the people. In contrast, a people-centered approach to justice understands and thinks about how people experience justice and injustice. It will draw on evidence of what works to meet people's justice needs. And it will be delivered by an inclusive justice system open to partnership with other sectors. This last point is really important because we have to recognize that we lawyers or we who are involved in the administration of justice don't know everything. And we live in a world where there is integration of systems and people don't work in silos. It's really important for us to recognize that, to draw on expertise, and to really bring about efficiencies that are people-centered, and most importantly, listen to people. There are some common justice problems. Violence and crime in the public sphere at work and at home. Disputes over housing or land or conflicts with neighbors. Family disputes, for example, around divorce and inheritance. You can imagine the frustrations that people experience. If we could find a people-centered approach, and we've seen this in action in other countries where elders, for example, will mediate a matter and it is settled very quickly, binding mediation. Problems at work, whether as an employee or a business owner, imagine that frustration for the employee and the employer, the owner. Problems with money and debt, or consumer problems, and difficulties related to access and quality of public services. This is a major problem, not just in developing countries, but also in developed countries also, who feel that the system doesn't allow them to have access to redress issues that they have at all with the public or service providers, with banks, with other consumer type entities and so forth. Major problems. So how do we move from justice for the few to justice for all? This requires a transformation in ambition, a sustained effort to provide billions, 5.1, with access to justice. We want to help people resolve their justice problems, prevent large and small injustices from occurring, and create opportunities for people to participate fully in their societies and their economies. We're focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals. Justice is the common thread through all of them, all 17. And without increased justice, not only won't we be able to really have sustainable development, but we will not be able to end poverty, reduce inequality, and reach the furthest behind first. We won't be able to create conditions for shared and sustainable prosperity, or promote peace and inclusion, and promote and protect fundamental rights. So what is our call to action? We'd like to see the acceleration of progress and all partners coming together in a global and sustained effort to deliver justice for all by 2030. And we've presented in our report an agenda for action that will help deliver justice for all by 2030. There will be a high-level political forum in July and an SDG summit in September. And from goals to commitments to results into the decade of delivery on the 2030 agenda. I commend our report to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison Maynard-Gibson. We admire your stamina standing here before us after such a long night of travel, and we thank you very much for this way of representing the report. I would now like to give the floor to Mary Robinson. She has already been introduced to you, and she's also often introduced as someone who needs no introduction, Chair of the Elders. Please, I give you the floor.
Merci et bonjour. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir de revenir à Ottawa pour cet événement. It's also a pleasure to follow such a comprehensive analysis of the task force report from Alison Gibson. I'm glad that this report is being discussed in the context of the 6th OGP Global Summit, which I'll be attending this afternoon. The Elders, as I think you know, is a group of global leaders working for peace, justice, and human rights, which was founded by Nelson Mandela. And we're pleased that Hina Jilani, as you saw, is a co-chair of the task force on our behalf. I have to confess that in recent years, I've been focused on a different kind of justice, climate justice, the injustice of climate change. But actually, it links quite a bit with this overall report. And 10 years ago, I was a member, I think it's 11 years ago now, I was a member of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. And our report in 2008 found that more than 4 billion people lived outside the protection of the law, meaning that they didn't have effective access to legal systems when they needed them. It's frankly shaming to admit that more than a decade on from that landmark report, the scale of the justice gap, as you've heard, has worsened. As Alison said, more than 5 billion people don't have meaningful access to justice. And this is it's a damning indictment of our global political and legal systems. And as she said, this includes also 1.5 billion people who can't resolve their justice problems, such as victims of unreported violence or crime, or who cannot resolve a dispute over land or the denial of a public service. And what we know is that such situations can have a kind of cascading impact on individual lives, on families, on communities, and the wider social fabric. Many people become unemployed. Around a third of people with a justice problem are likely to experience a physical or mental health problem. And as Martin Luther King reminded us, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And as we've heard, justice is a thread that runs through the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Without access to justice at every level in society, we stand little chance of achieving the wider SDGs. World leaders acknowledged this when they signed up to the goals in 2015, and our challenge today is to hold them to account, and also to put pressure on donor governments and multilateral institutions. Meanwhile, the failure to provide justice is costly. And again, Alison has gone through these figures, but I think they're worth repeating. And I'd like to begin with estimates from some governments. Recent estimates from the British government show that unresolved disputes and serious legal problems may cost that economy up to 3.5 billion annually. On a global scale, violence against women is estimated to cost between 1% and 4% of GDP. The financial costs to private businesses have been found to be as high as 3.7% of GDP in Peru and 6.5% of GDP in Bolivia. In the United States alone, the cost of intimate partner violence exceeds 8.3 billion per year. And I do think it's worth repeating the estimates of cost that Alison put particular emphasis on of providing universal access to basic justice. In low-income countries, it would cost $20 per year to provide each person with access to basic justice services. In middle-income countries, $64, and in high-income countries, 190. And as you said, Alison, this is not a huge amount of money, and yet we've neglected this field. We've funded education, we've funded health, and somehow this is a real gap that we have to address. And beyond finance, I couldn't agree more with her presentation. We need to shift away from justice reforms that focus solely on institutions and move to a people-centered approach that embraces legal empowerment. And this approach has a focus on preventing injustice, is open to innovation, and works in collaboration with other sectors, such as health and education. Recognizing the fundamental importance of justice, the elders launched our own Access to Justice initiative in February in The Hague, and we'll use our collective moral voice and indeed our convening power to call for greater commitments and funding for access to justice. As has already been mentioned, in July, countries will report to the UN at the high-level political forum for the first time on their progress on delivering access to justice as part of their SDG commitments. And the elders have written to heads of state, encouraging them to make ambitious funding commitments, in particular for grassroots justice defenders and to increase access to justice services for women, as has been rightly emphasized this morning. As we embark on this new initiative as elders, we're grateful for the support we've received from a wide range of civil society groups and activists who are working on the front lines, often in circumstances of physical danger and political risk. We learned a lot from the Sparks of Hope, grassroots organizations that embody the change the elders want to see in the world. They were gathered together during our 10th anniversary year, ending on Madiba's birthday on the 18th of July, 2018. For example, the Women's Law Centre in Moldova, where female lawyers provide access to justice for survivors of gender-based violence, or Namati, whose paralegals in Sierra Leone helped to empower communities to take back their land that had been acquired by companies illegally. And we'll hear more about that on our panel later. Last year, I had the great pleasure of visiting our co-chair, Argentina, with Hina Jelani, and marching in the street, carrying the banners, Access to Justice. And we had a very funny band leading us. It was quite fun to be behind such an extravagant band. And I'm sure you remember Ambassador leading us along the streets of Buenos Aires. And we were particularly impressed while we were there by going along to the Access to Justice centers, which are placing justice services in the hearts of communities and offering holistic services under one roof to people who may be experiencing justice problems. This open government partnership global summit presents an opportunity to share justice innovations, as well as make concrete commitments on how to better deliver justice services which enhance open government. it's positive to see the increase in justice commitments made at OGP over this past few years, and I sincerely hope that this will increase. The elders want our voices to complement and to amplify civil society voices. We stand in solidarity with you and with all, and we'll do all we can to make your voices heard when we meet with heads of state, government officials, and policymakers in countries around the world, so that access to justice is a right afforded to everyone and not just a privilege of the minority. Thank you very much. Merci. Merci. Okay.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic contribution. My name is Arjan de Haan. I'm the director of the Inclusive Economies programs at Canada's International Development Research Center, and I have the great honor to chair the next panel. I am not allowed to introduce Mary Robinson anymore because everybody said he. But just to say, it's like when my 15-year-old daughter this morning asked, "Why do you look so happy getting up 7 o'clock in the morning?" I said, "I get to be on a panel with Mary Robinson." This is such an honor. Thank you so much for being here and your introduction. Can I ask the other panelists then to come to the podium as well, and introduce them as they take their seats. On my far left, on your right is Marika Wierde, who is is with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she is the rule of law coordinator and has a long reputation, history of working on transitional justice for about 20 years, starting, I believe, with the Yugoslav Tribunal. And on your left is, and thank you for being here as well, is Eleanor Thompson, who is a lawyer with the organization Namati that is based in Sierra Leone. I won't say much about their work because they will do so in the panel. Let me start off. Is the mic working? Thank you so much. Let me start off with. And I think, Ms. Robinson, you have already given some indications of that, but those numbers are really, that the report presents, are really striking. 5 billion people, 2/3 of the world's population lack meaningful access to justice. 4.5 are excluded from the opportunities that the law provides. We've also heard your and the earlier main recommendations for a people-centered approach to justice. Now, to start the discussion, help us please put a human face to these huge and overwhelming numbers. Can you each, and if I can start with Ms. Robinson, can you give us an illustration of 1 or 2 justice issues that come to mind from the context where you have worked in?
Well, speaking about access to justice in Ireland, I think one of the things that's happened recently is the use of technology very effectively, so that it's possible for online services to actually help people to solve justice problems before they go to court. And this is actually quite useful in particular societies. What I'm very interested in is hearing more about the Namati's work in places like Sierra Leone. I know Namati's work in Kenya. On a wind power problem for the Maasai indigenous peoples, because it was the biggest wind power project in Africa, and they just didn't think about pastoralists having land, and the wind power wasn't going to service them at all. But Namati helped my friend Alice. I'm an elder. I'm not so good on names at this stage. But anyway, helped her to actually stop the whole project until consideration was given to the. And that's just a kind of major example of where just having access to justice, knowing you have rights, is so important, and it made such a difference to that community. So. It has been rightly been mentioned, access of women to land rights, to access to remedies for violence in the home or violence anywhere. All of that has a huge effect on communities, and that's what we have to think about also.
Right. Maybe then turn to Eleanor. Maybe you can build on that.
Thank you, Ambassador Robinson, for giving that example of some of Namati's work in Kenya. In Sierra Leone, one of our greatest assets is land. But unfortunately, for long now, many Sierra Leoneans, particularly in rural areas, fall into the category of the 5.1 billion people who are not able to access justice, or even the 1.5 billion who the report notes that they have civil or administrative justice issues like those related to land that they have not been able to resolve. And an example in one of the cases we've worked on is in 2012, there was an investor in oil palm who essentially entered into a one-sided land deal with traditional authorities, the chiefdom authorities, with no involvement of landowners. This was a deal essentially to lease 30,000 hectares of land in Makpele Chiefdom in Pujan district. That area is essentially the entire chiefdom, which means people's villages, their water sources, their farms, their livelihood sources, everything falls within the land that was given for this oil palm investment. Landowners received less than a quarter of the amount that they should have been receiving in rent. There was no compensation for crops or economic trees that had been on the land. There was no provision made for land for them to engage in farming or other livelihood activities. And so obviously the communities felt, helpless as to what they could do. And they didn't feel that they had any rights, neither under the agreement that had been made, nor vis-a-vis the company or traditional authorities. And the land justice challenges that we see, like the one in the Makpele Chiefdom, are really due to a number of factors, including outdated laws, women's inability to access land because of customary laws, lack of grievance redress mechanisms. So in this case, what could the landowners actually do to enforce rights that they didn't even know that they had at the time against the company? And then obviously insufficient legal assistance to communities or individuals who are engaging with these investors. So what we've seen is we've seen that even where you have legal or policy reforms, like the National Land Policy of 2015, which is rather progressive, those don't really have much meaningful effect without really a participatory approach. So this people-centered approach that the report really emphasizes, where you have the community being a part of, for example, demarcation of their lands and mapping exercises that facilitates land titling, which then puts them in a position to be able to bargain or negotiate with an investor who is coming in. They know how much land they have, they know what they're working with. And so part of what we've been able to do at Namati, for example, in this example in Makpele Chiefdom, was through legal empowerment, through helping the various communities within that chiefdom to know what the law says in terms of what a lease agreement, what the terms of a lease agreement should be in the provinces in Sierra Leone, as well as what their rights are vis-a-vis the lessor, the investor, and then also helping them to actually carry out participatory mapping, and then having consultations with them, helping them in the actual renegotiation of an agreement with the company. So that 30,000 hectares eventually in a renegotiated agreement was reduced to 2,320 hectares. The new agreement includes provisions on crop compensation, environmental standards, and also even profit sharing. So they're and an outgrower scheme. So they're getting benefits from their own land in addition to the development project of the investor.
Of course, it also helps to have a Harvard Law graduate like Eleanor.
I want to come back to that later, perhaps, on how this works. I'm stunned by the figures in the report on the affordability, and I think affordability should be a secondary issue, but it is really, really important. But before I come back to that and how this work, maybe from your experience, similar, is like give examples of main issues on justice and processes that help overcome the barriers.
First of all, just allow me to thank Canada, thank the Center for Pluralism, but also IDRC and other partners, Argentina, Sierra Leone, the elders, everyone with whom we've been able to partner as the Netherlands on the Task Force on Justice. I bring greetings from my minister, Sigrid Kaag. She's extremely devoted to this issue, and she would like to also keep working on this. Many of us have worked towards a high-level political forum and want countries to make concrete commitments there on this agenda. But we will keep working after that too, and then we will need to see how we implement this agenda on the country level. And we are there to stay the course. And OGP is also an important part of this picture.
Right.
In the ministry, I work in a unit that looks at conflict in fragile and conflict-affected states. But I myself, grew up actually in a country which is in that category, and I'd like to cite an example from that country. I grew up in Yemen, and one of my childhood friends, let's call her Jamila, she married, as is very typical in Yemen, extremely young, at the age of 16. In Yemen, many men carry guns, and her husband was cleaning or fiddling with his gun. The gun ended up going off, and it shot her in the stomach. Her husband ended up divorcing her because he was not sure that she could bear children. You can think of the string of problems that is associated with this. But for someone like Jamila in a rural context in Yemen, there would be virtually no place to go with the complaints about this. The first port of call would probably be the families who would try to intercede with the husband to ask him to change his mind. There were no children from the marriage, but if there were, she would have lost custody of those children. She would have no property rights to speak of. And as a divorcee with a handicap, she would face many, many difficulties. This story actually has a happy ending because in the end, the husband ended up changing his mind, and in fact, she even bore children after this injury. So, but this is just to indicate, I think, the depth of the issues we're facing. The Task Force on Justice report can have this stunning effect because the extent of the problems we face are enormous. But I think we should bear in mind that there are also very serious problems that we have to resolve. You know, the problem of Syrians living outside of their country who faced massive human rights violations. These are parts of the challenge, and we will have to find solutions to deal both with the lighter end of the spectrum and with the very, very serious end of the spectrum.
Thanks so much. And like I said, I want to come back maybe at the end to the practical solutions. And like I said, the cost is really important, how that works. Before we go there, and I think Marieke, you've already alluded to how gendered the question of access to justice is. And of course, in Canada's with a foreign policy priorities with a feminist international assistance policy, this is we're happy to say it's like this is a key priority. But maybe I can turn to Mary first. Is like what does it mean, a gendered approach to the question?
I must say I think this is a vital issue, and I'm so glad to hear the minister from Canada put such emphasis on it. And I'm glad there is a separate focus on justice and women, and because that is absolutely necessary. I'd like to refer maybe to just two examples. First of all, we need more support for survivors of violence. And one of the sparks of hope is a good project in India, My Choices Foundation, because they hire local women as peacemakers who work in the community and who work to provide counseling and rights education and also basic legal aid to victims of violence. So it's women forming a community to help, which I think is a really important thing. And then the second thing is we need more women in the justice sector, more judges, more women police. I've had a link with the Association of Judges, and I've addressed them on a number of occasions, the Global Association. And in discussion with women judges, you really get the sense they can influence the system. I've seen that in Ireland when we got, the Chief Justice presiding over the Supreme Court. She really made a number of changes, some of them obvious changes, but they weren't obvious until she made them. And it's just to have people there, with the right ideas. I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Eleanor.
Yeah, just following from that, we can't really talk about access to justice or a gendered approach to access to justice without talking also about equitable access to resources. So in addition to issues of violence against women, we also need to talk about economic protections of women or economic empowerment of women that then affects how they are able to both experience and access justice. And in the Sierra Leone context, especially for rural women, that means equitable access to land. As I mentioned before, customary laws which do have equal status under our constitution to common law and statute, really create a challenge. So even where we have beautifully written statutes that, on the devolution of estates or registration of customary marriages and divorces that provide some legal and economic protections, for women in terms of succession issues, those really mean little in practice, or where in communities, customary law, which in almost all of our all the ethnic groups that we have rules that are based on patrilineage, and so really one of the things that we have sought to do is look at strategies that would address sort of how women experience or women's participation in processes that affect, for example, their access to land. So legal empowerment, specifically targeting women, that helps them to know what their rights are under the law. We also realize that it's important to not just speak to women, and that one of the foundations of helping to even out this balance, especially on land-related issues, is for communities as a whole to really recognize what women's contribution are as land users. So even if they're reliant on a system or where the head of the family, usually a male, is distributing land, they really are the primary users. And what effect does that then have on the community economically, socially, et cetera? And then ensuring that within governance structures that are being created at the community level for the management of land, that women are not only members of those governance structures, but that they also are part of, for example, negotiation processes with investors, which they're normally completely excluded from, and you hardly see a woman signing a land lease agreement, for example. So these are some of the strategies that we're now looking at employing to address the practicalities of ensuring that the law becomes a reality.
Marike, from your perspective, what is a feminist approach?
I mean, gender is a very important issue for us as well. We're jealous of Canada's feminist foreign policy. We don't quite have that, but we try to give it a lot of prominence in our work. one thing that we try to do at the ministry in looking at access to justice is to set targets on which we report to our parliament. And within that target, we said we need to achieve that 50% of our beneficiaries are women. This may sound straightforward, but it actually can be quite difficult to achieve in practice, especially in the kinds of countries, the fragile and conflict-affected states. But this forces us to measure, which also means that it forces our partners to measure. And there isn't necessarily in many countries the practice of doing that. But I think this issue of data, and this is also an SDG agenda, is a very important tool because it can teach us much more about how we should approach these problems. And the second thing that I would say is, I think the issues facing women are often interlinked. So that if you allow me to cite an example from Sierra Leone, the Truth Commission in Sierra Leone found that the reason why sexual violence was so prevalent in the conflict, also forced marriage, was essentially related to the very low status that women enjoyed generally in that society. And therefore, they made all kinds of recommendations on strengthening inheritance and property rights and all these kinds of issues in order to really promote the status of women in that society. I think that may be true for other countries as well. In Afghanistan, up to 87% of women will experience abuse during their lifetime. So I think this holistic approach and tackling the issue from these many dimensions and stepping over silos is very important for the SDG agenda. And certainly it's something we try. And I would also commend the Argentinians, I think, who in their one-stop approach in these legal centers, yeah, I think that's part of the answer.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to see if I can get some questions in from the audience, given time. But before we go there, if we have time, what about other issues of exclusion? And certainly sitting in the Global Center for Pluralism, what about the other dimension of discrimination related to caste, to class, to race, and over the last, and I think Mary, what you said about the last 20 years has not seen any progress, and a lot of this has to do with growing forms of exclusion on other dimensions. How can we bring this into the way forward?
One of the stunning figures in the Taskforce report is that more than 1 billion people lack legal identity and therefore are extraordinarily vulnerable. Don't count. If you don't count, well,
right.
How do you
don't count?
And
yes.
I think it's great that in Kenya and Jordan and Bangladesh there's a real focus on acquiring legal identity, and I'm sure it's more widespread than that. What I wanted to say about the Taskforce report in particular is, it was so strange after our report on legal empowerment of the poor, that 4 billion people hadn't access. It just dropped like a kind of stone. It wasn't picked up at all, really. Now we're in a different position. First of all, the evidence-based work done by the Taskforce, the links with the World Bank, with everybody, the links with civil society, Namati, etc. That's important. And secondly, the fact that it's now part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think many of us, and I've said this myself, feel that unless justice is tackled, we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not going to achieve the leave no one behind. There's no way. Right. So justice has become much more of a central concept. And I think this is the real hope. And legal empowerment is becoming something meaningful. And so I think we're happily in a different era, but it does take countries pushing, as the Netherlands has been. I've been to The Hague and I'll be back there again, and Canada and other countries really pushing on the need for more resources, the need for more funding. That's absolutely vital, going forward.
Right. Thanks. I know.
Yes, and the one thing that the report emphasizes is that this mission, this goal of justice for all, is in and of itself a process of inclusion. Is that if we're going to achieve that, we have to be able to bring citizens in as part of the effort to achieve justice. I think even at the end of the report, there's an admonition to citizens to really be part of of these efforts, that it can't just be left to governments. And some of the strategies that we've been using or models that we've been using, such as legal empowerment, are geared exactly toward that, to bridging this gap between, whether it's those in urban and rural areas, it's bridging gaps between citizens who, for whatever reason, feel marginalized, and those who have more privilege. And so it's really getting citizens to understand not only what laws and policies are, but really what citizenship is about and what that means in the context of contributing to helping to bring everybody, up, to move everyone forward. And so I think that we're getting there. We're moving. What the report proposes and the approach it takes in terms of encouraging a really participatory approach, and is the start. We just have to keep moving along that road.
From our point of view, I think that access to justice and inclusive or open government are, maybe if we're serious about being people-centered, to many people, they may be very similar issues. Mm-hmm. And people may not differentiate as strictly as we do as professionals to say your contact is with the justice system or with another branch of government. It's more about how they're being received, how they're being heard, whether their needs are acknowledged, and whether they are genuinely treated with dignity in that process. So I think the SDG agenda presents this real opportunity to step outside of those silos and step over professional kind of gaps. Inclusivity also and access to justice, I think, are both inoculations or immunizations against conflict. Right. I mean, we can all remember how the Arab Spring got started by Mohammed Bouazizi, who burned himself because he was being plagued by the police and he had nowhere to go. So I think the prevention agenda, it's also very important for the Netherlands, is also an essential part of this. And only by giving more access to justice and more inclusive political processes at the front end will we be able to prevent everything that conflict brings at the back end. So that's a high priority for us.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you for the main recommendation at the end of the and I'm going to ask you permission. We're probably going to run slightly over time, but I have 3-4 people have indicated they want to make a contribution, ask a question. So with your permission, we will do that. I'm going to ask you to briefly say who you are and keep your comments short if you can. And I'm going to start on my left, sir. And then the lady next to you. Thank you.
So my question is basically, I'm Irvin Waller. I work primarily on crime prevention and victim assistance issues. I've just been in Rome for the EGM, so I've heard a presentation like this. I congratulate you on it being particularly clear. I want to also congratulate the Dutch government on actually setting targets. The reason I put this T-shirt on this morning is that governments, I think, have done very little to actually engage with the SDGs. So the Dutch government, yes, Sierra Leone, yes, Argentina. I live in Ottawa, and I have yet to meet somebody who's actually heard of SDGs. And this is a city of public servants, and you meet people in parliament, you meet senior public servants. So I think there is a really critical issue as to how we're going to engage governments in doing this. And I was at the EGM in Rome around violence prevention. And if you just take the United States, if they actually use the knowledge they have to stop violence against women and street violence, they would save something of the order of $70 billion. That is almost exactly $190 times the population of the United States. Another way of looking at it is that the United States spends $87 billion on prisons, and if it incarcerated at the Dutch or Canadian level, it would also save $70 billion. But I think this idea that it's cost effective is incredibly important.
Right.
But I think governments have to be spending much more on engaging cities, city of Ottawa, for instance, in actually discussing these, like Nuremberg or Malmo, or else all this wonderful talk is going to be wonderful talk, and 10 years from now, we're going to be no further forward. And in fact, the amount of money on access to justice is going to have dropped even more from the 40% that it's already gone up.
Thank you so much for the contribution. I think it strongly reinforces the messages that the report and the panel.
Thank you. And my name is Yasmin Hortensi, and I'm a member of Parliament, and I'm the chair of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And we do talk about SDG goals. But I have a question for you. As I was reading it, 60% of the population in Sierra Leone live outside Freetown. And so access to justice becomes problematic, and tribalism or tribal heads do it. So I would like to know, what is the solution to this? Do you have elders that can be trained as maybe not pseudo-justice, but can be trained so they can tell people, here are the options available to you? Because there are 1.5 million people who don't even know that they have a justice problem. So your solutions would be really welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The gentleman standing in the back.
Trevor Farrow from the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice and Osgoode Hall Law School. Thank you so much for the report. So many exciting things in here. I'm wondering if the panel has good examples on advice about really mobilizing the public. And numbers of you have spoken in different ways. We do have government officials, even in this country, who are really committed to the idea. We've got others around, but I think the real power will come from the people, not so much necessarily those who are in the system, but just everyday people. So moving from that shift that we've had from understanding everyday justice to now really making it a coffee table conversation over the next decade of mobilization. How are we going to do that in the way that we got people talking about exercise and food and diet?
Thank you so much. And the last, I believe you had raised your hand as well for a question. And I want to go back for a very brief comment.
Alyssa Goldberg, I'm Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy at Global Affairs Canada, and I'm just delighted with this remarkable panel. So thank you so much for your insights this morning, and to the colleagues who introduced, and to the Centre for Global Pluralism for hosting. In fact, I had a similar question around informal justice, because of course the report really places the emphasis on the formal justice system, but the handshakes that we have to make with informal justice systems, particularly in fragile and vulnerable environments. It's certainly something I have been challenged with when I've been posted overseas into a number of difficult environments. And how do we make this effective handshake, particularly for women and girls who in informal justice systems tend to be doubly disadvantaged in those environments and lacking voice. And just to reinforce on the SDGs, since I have a platform, we actually are in the midst of developing a national strategy on the SDGs. And so I hope everyone in this room will get involved. Our colleagues at ESDC have launched an online platform in order to develop the national strategy. They're doing outreach in cities across the country. So now is your opportunity to have your voice heard on what our targets should be for our SDG strategy.
Thank you all so much for those contributions. I think I'm going to turn back to the panel for last concluding remarks. I think two key questions around the mobilization of communities around the world, and also a strong demand for knowing more about practical solutions, particularly around informal justice. So can I turn back to you in the same order? I know this is a huge task, but
okay. Yes, very good points and questions from the floor. I agree that the Sustainable Development Goals are not sufficiently known. I always wear this badge now. First of all, because it's the only badge in the UN that I really like. You know? So,
the T-shirt is not bad.
But I wish it was more. You know, I wish somebody would get thousands of them and spread them around so that we actually, greet each other with, with this commitment kind of, thing. But I wanted to make a point that links with my preoccupation with climate justice, and with the fact that people are beginning to really understand now that something has changed fundamentally and we need to get worried about it. And the children have helped a lot by coming out of school, Fridays for Future, and mainstreaming intergenerational justice. We cannot get that climate justice, intergenerational justice, unless we completely link it with the Sustainable Development Goals, get out of our silos. So build on the growing awareness of climate issues to make that also an awareness that the Sustainable Development Goal issues are completely linked. And then we are, having a holistic approach and leaving no one behind. And it's completely relevant to what we were saying. I just wanted to talk about the informal justice, the last question, and more reflect on the difficulty I had when I had the honor to be appointed the special envoy to the Great Lakes. I was told I was the highest woman mediator in the world, and I said to Ban Ki-moon, well, not before time. The fact that in 2013 I was still kind of the first woman doing something. Well, anyway, the UN has improved and now has its parity, etc. So, but the point I wanted to do it, putting a lot of emphasis on including, in particular, women's groups. There were times in Goma when I had to throw out the men so that I could speak to the women on their own, because in the mixed group, the women would not speak. And there were so many issues. And eventually we formed a women's platform of women from DRC, Sierra Leone, Burundi and Uganda, which I'm glad to say is still going on, in order to get all of these issues with a strong women's voice, women's participation, because otherwise nothing was going to change, especially on the violence against women that was so prevalent. But believe me, it was so difficult. That's really the point I'm making. And all those barriers are there. And that's why we have to work very hard.
Thank you so much. Anna.
Yes, so thank you very much to the Honorable MP and the Assistant Deputy Minister for your questions on the informal justice system and what we can really do to address this access to justice challenge. This is taking place in the margins of the OGP Global Summit. And Sierra Leone is currently working on its third national action plan. And we are working to ensure that, again, there's a commitment on access to justice that focuses on expanding community-based justice services, as well as strengthening local redress mechanisms. And that doesn't necessarily mean traditional authorities. It could, but it also even means looking at local governments, the district councils, and what roles they can play as redress mechanisms. There are 29, I believe, local governments that are members of OGP, or that are something, 20-something. And I mean, this is an example of how we are thinking about making commitments on justice closest to where it needs to be delivered. There was a study done by OSIWA last year that looked at how citizens experience justice, especially in rural areas. And where you have only 8% who are using formal courts versus 13% or so that are getting assistance through informal organizations, and where you have a much higher resolution of cases being solved through informal justice mechanisms, 54% actually being solved or resolved through informal justice mechanisms, as opposed to 18% being resolved through formal courts. You have to develop a reform agenda centered around expanding like community-based services, whether it's deployment of paralegals. And luckily, this is actually in line with the government's policy commitment. So we're at a very opportune moment right now to say, okay, let's take not just the policy commitments you've made as a government, as well as your commitments to achieving SDG 16.3, and use the OGP platform, use this third national action plan as a means of accelerating your progress or your achievement of the commitments that you've already made to expand informal justice service delivery as a complement to the formal system.
Thank you so much, Marika.
Yeah, just briefly, just on the informal justice system, I think it's worth noting that even in countries like the Netherlands, most people resolve their legal problems outside of the courtroom. And before they come to a full litigation, I think the figure for people who really go the full length of litigation is 5 or 6%. It's very low. So I think a key message of the report is that we have to think much more broadly about the sector in any society. And that's also what's strong about this whole message. It's universal, so there aren't even that strict distinctions. I think this is a general problem. Secondly, how do we make this a more grassroots movement? It's a challenge. And maybe we as a government are not in the best position to do that. But I think if we're serious, for instance, about data and about doing more legal needs surveys, those provide also a great opportunity, I think, to do a lot of awareness on rights and on helping people understand how to claim their rights. So I think there are lots of practical opportunities that we should utilize. But then finally, as a government, our emphasis will stay on rallying other governments. And in in February, we hosted 20 heads of government, ministers of justice. If only it were heads of government. I'm dreaming, I think. But, ministers of justice in The Hague, and we really emphasize with them the need to make concrete commitments on people-centered justice. In June, we will host another 15 G7 plus ministers from fragile and conflict-affected states. We'll be doing the same with them, and then we hope to take this process forward and to form a group of countries from across the world that are really interested in pursuing this going forward.
Right.
So we would encourage all of you to join us in these efforts.
Thank you so much. I think thank you so much. We've come to the end of the session. I want to thank the audience that was here. I apologize for not having more time for questions. I also apologize for not recognizing the people that I should have recognized in the audience. I want to thank the Global Center, John, for hosting this with us. Of course, the Deputy Minister for being here and your inspiring words. Colleagues from Argentina, Ms. Maynard Gibson, of course, for making this hard journey from Boston, and thank you for your inspiration. And of course, the panel, Mary Robinson, Eleanor Thompson, and Enrique Vierda. Thank you all for your contribution. I apologize for missing people. Thank you for the partnership. Thank you for the inspiration. I think it's very clear what the challenge is. I think the point the report has made about we can do things about it. We have solutions. It is affordable, but we need to do more to mobilize the communities. Marika, thanks for those last words, and do that in an inclusive manner with all sectors as a core part of the SDGs, and we'll buy the T-shirt or at least the pin. So thank you for that as well. Thank you, Maaike, for the partnership, and I'm going to turn over to you for a few last words about the next steps of this work. But thank you so much.
Just to keep it very brief, I was slightly worried that we would be speaking about all the details of the report and it wouldn't be obvious what was next. But I have been completely comforted by everything that's been said by the speakers, by the panelists, by the questions. I think there's such an awareness that there's a lot to be done. The report is there, but we won't stop here. The countries leading this effort won't stop. Where we have this movement of organizations and people, I invite you all to join and keep working in this area. We have the high-level political forum in July, the SDG Summit in September, and then we go into the next 4 years that are a big opportunity for us to start delivering on the SDGs, start delivering on SDG 16. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has already called for this to be a decade for delivery. I think the justice sector is in a good place to really get serious about results and improving justice outcomes for people. I won't repeat all the thanks, just for your participation and your time. Merci à tous. À la prochaine.